January 1944. A cold morning settles over a prisoner of war camp in the American Midwest. Frost clings to the wire fences. Guard towers stand silent. Inside a long wooden barrack, the air smells of paper and dust not oil. German prisoners enter the room slowly. Some still wear field-gray coats faded by captivity. Others carry notebooks scavenged from ration packaging. They stop without instruction. Before them rise shelves. Not a few. Not symbolic stacks. But walls of books, thousands of volumes. History, engineering, Goethe, Schiller, Mark Twain, mathematics manuals. American newspapers stacked by date. Dictionaries in multiple languages. Even titles once forbidden at home. No guards rush them. No slogans hang on the walls. There are no speeches. Only tables, chairs, and silence, for men raised under total information control where radios were regulated. Books burned and truth edited. This room feels unreal. Some reach out, touching spines to confirm they are solid. Others hesitate, uncertain whether reading freely is allowed. In that quiet moment, the war changes shape. No shots are fired. No orders are shouted. Yet something rigid begins to bend, because inside these camps, the United States has opened a front with no uniforms. One fought with ideas. By the time German soldiers began walking into American prisoner of war camps, the war that had shaped them was already slipping away. The first large waves arrived in 1942. Others followed in 1943. They came from North Africa, from the shattered Axis lines in Tunisia, from the surrender at El Alamein, from the slow collapse of German and Italian forces under Allied pressure. These were not isolated captures. They were mass defeats, unfolding under a strategic imbalance. Germany could no longer hide. In May 1943, nearly 275,000 Axis soldiers surrendered in North Africa alone. Among them were experienced Wehrmacht infantrymen, Luftwaffe technicians, Afrika Korps veterans, and young conscripts who had never seen Germany beyond their training grounds. The surrender did not feel temporary. It felt final. Britain, already under strain from bombing and rationing, could not hold them all. Nor could North Africa. The Atlantic became a transport route not just for tanks and food, but for men who would no longer fight. Convoys crossed under heavy guard. U-boats still prowled, but the Allies judged the risk acceptable. Prisoners were now cargo. The United States had space. It had railroads. It had food surpluses. And it had not yet been scarred by war on its own soil. By late 1943, the U.S. held more than 425,000 German prisoners. By the end of the war, that number would exceed 370,000 Germans at one time, spread across more than 500 camps and branch facilities. From Arizona deserts to Michigan farmland, from Louisiana pine forests to the plains of Iowa, German soldiers found themselves surrounded not by ruins but by abundance. This alone unsettled them. Most had been raised on images of American decadence and weakness. Nazi propaganda portrayed the United States as racially fractured, culturally hollow, incapable of discipline. Instead, prisoners encountered order. Clean barracks, regular meals, medical care, a predictability absent even in Germany by 1943, but the shock was not merely material. Under the Geneva Convention of 1929, prisoners were entitled to humane treatment. The U.S. military followed these rules closely, not out of sentiment, but calculation. Well-treated prisoners were easier to manage. They worked willingly. They rioted less. They lived. And so German posts worked American farms. They harvested cotton in Texas, cut timber in Oregon, picked sugar beets in Colorado. They were paid small wages credited to camp accounts. They bought toothpaste, paper, sometimes books. The work details exposed them to civilian America. Children waved. Farmers talked. Newspapers lay openly on tables. Radios played music unrestricted by ideology. It was not re-education yet, but the isolation was cracking. Still, inside the camps, the old hierarchy remained. Nazi officers attempted to maintain discipline. Salutes continued. Hardline believers intimidated others. Some prisoners were beaten or ostracized for appearing soft. In several camps, American authorities had to separate fanatical Nazis from moderates to prevent violence. The U.S. military watched carefully. American intelligence officers noticed something unexpected. Many prisoners were not defiant. They were confused. They asked questions about Roosevelt, about race relations, about labor unions, about the size of American industry. They wanted books, technical manuals, maps, not propaganda-information. This curiosity did not fit existing POW doctrine, but it suggested something larger. The war for territory was being fought overseas. But here, behind barbed wire, another struggle was forming, one that would not require artillery. It would require access, and that access would soon be institutionalized. The American POW system. By 1943, the United States was no longer improvising its prisoner of war policy. It was building a system. The War Department understood that holding hundreds of thousands of enemy soldiers was not a temporary problem. It was a logistical, psychological, and political challenge that would last years. Camps could not simply warehouse men. They had to function quietly, efficiently, and without becoming radicalizing incubators. The blueprint was deliberate. Most German POW camps were built away from population centers but close to rail lines and agricultural regions. Camps like Algona in Iowa, Papago Park in Arizona, Fort Getty in Rhode Island, and Camp Shelby in Mississippi followed standardized layouts, barracks arranged in blocks, mess halls, infirmaries, recreation fields. Guard towers were present but unobtrusive. The intent was control without provocation. Inside these camps, order was enforced not by brutality but by routine. Prisoners rose at set hours. Roll calls were conducted. Work details were assigned. Meals were predictable and, by wartime standards, generous. Calories often exceeded those available to German civilians by 1944. This disparity did not go unnoticed by the prisoners or by Allied planners. Under the Geneva Convention, prisoners were allowed intellectual and recreational activity. The United States expanded this provision beyond the minimum. Sports leagues were formed. Music groups rehearsed. Theater performances were permitted. Religious services were organized across denominations. And then there were the libraries. At first, camp libraries were small. A few donated books, technical manuals, religious texts, but demand surged. Prisoners asked for more, especially in German. American camp commanders, initially indifferent, began reporting that educated prisoners were calmer, more cooperative, and less prone to discipline issues. The office of the Provost Marshal General took note. By late 1943, a policy shift emerged. If prisoners wanted to read, let them read. If they wanted to learn, facilitate it. Books were cheaper than guards. Knowledge, it seemed, reduced resistance. What followed was unprecedented. The U.S. Army partnered with universities, libraries, the YMCA, and civilian publishers. German-language books were sourced in bulk. Titles banned by the Nazi regime, Thomas Mann, Erich Maria Remarque, Sigmund Freud, were quietly added to shelves. Political texts explaining American constitutional law, federalism, and labor systems appeared alongside literature and science. Camp libraries grew rapidly. Some reached collections of 10,000 to 20,000 volumes. In several camps, POW libraries surpassed nearby civilian school libraries in size and diversity. This was not accidental. American officials were careful not to label the program as re-education at first. That word implied coercion. Instead, the approach was framed as access. No lectures, no forced readings, no overt denunciations of Nazism. Prisoners chose what to read, and many chose widely. Newspapers were another turning point. German posts received uncensored international news, reports of Allied advances, accounts of bombings in Germany. Later, details of concentration camps. At first, many dismissed these as enemy lies, but the volume was overwhelming. Different sources, consistent details, photographs. Doubt began to grow. To manage ideological tensions, American authorities segregated camps internally. Known Nazi loyalists were isolated. Moderate and apolitical prisoners were placed together. This reduced intimidation and opened space for discussion, behind the scenes. A small group of American officers and academics observed closely. They believed something rare was happening. Stripped of propaganda, given time, safety, and information, enemy soldiers were reconsidering the world that had shaped them. By early 1944. This observation became policy. The United States did not merely guard German prisoners anymore. It was preparing to change them, and that transformation would reveal itself, not in riots or rebellions, but in reading rooms, debates, and quiet moments between bookshelves. Those moments would soon be examined from multiple angles. Angle 1. The human angle, hunger beyond food for many German prisoners. Captivity in America produced an unexpected absence. It was not the absence of freedom. That was understood. It was the absence of mental pressure, the constant ideological noise that had filled their lives since childhood, from the Hitler Youth onward. German men had lived inside a sealed narrative. Newspapers spoke with one voice. Radios carried approved truths. Books were sorted by loyalty. Even private conversations carried risk. By the time war came, thinking independently was not encouraged. It was dangerous inside American POW camps. That pressure dissolved. No one told prisoners what to think. No one demanded ideological participation. The silence unsettled them. In that vacuum, a different hunger emerged, not for bread, but for explanation. Libraries became crowded not out of obligation, but curiosity. Prisoners who had never read for pleasure sat for hours with novels. Others sought engineering texts to understand how American factories outproduced Germany's. Former teachers resumed teaching. Mechanics studied modern design. Young soldiers discovered authors whose names had been erased at home. Some read simply to escape, others to argue, many to verify what they had been told was impossible. Human reactions varied. A few rejected everything, retreating into rigid loyalty. But many experienced something quieter, a slow mental uncoupling. The realization that information could exist without command. This was not conversion. It was reorientation, and it began with choice. Angle 2, the psychological. Angle dissonance without violent. Psychological warfare is often imagined as loud leaflets dropped from planes, radio broadcasts, slogans shouted across lines. Inside American POW camps, it was nearly invisible. German prisoners were not instructed to abandon Nazism. They were shown alternatives. The effect was subtle but powerful. Psychologists later described it as cognitive dissonance, the tension between long-held beliefs and conflicting evidence. The U.S. system applied this not by confrontation, but by exposure. Prisoners read about American labor unions while working alongside unionized civilians. They read about racial segregation while observing integrated military units. They studied democratic systems while witnessing officers who could be questioned without punishment. Nothing was explained directly. The contradictions spoke for themselves. This method avoided resistance. There was no enemy voice to reject, no authority to rebel against, only material that quietly asked the prisoner to decide. Some responded with anger, others with denial. But many responded with silence and then discussion. Debates erupted in barracks. Not shouting matches, but prolonged arguments stretching late into the night. Men compared articles, quoted books, tested memories against printed fact. The ideological certainty that once unified them began to fracture. Importantly, this fracture did not produce chaos. It produced thought. Angle 3, the American angle, control through stability from the American perspective. The library system was not born from idealism alone. It was pragmatic. Camp commanders reported that educated prisoners were easier to manage. Literacy reduced boredom. Discussion replaced violence. Libraries became pressure valves. Where books were plentiful, discipline problems declined. This stability mattered. With manpower stretched thin overseas, the U.S. could not afford constant unrest at home. A quiet camp was a successful camp, but there was also foresight. American planners understood that these men would one day return to Germany. The war would end. Occupation would begin. The future would depend not just on military defeat, but on mental reconstruction. Providing access to books was inexpensive. The potential return was enormous. Without slogans or ceremonies. The United States was shaping an environment where democracy was not preached, but observed, where freedom was not declared, but practiced. This approach carried risk. Critics warned of leniency. Some politicians questioned why enemy soldiers lived better than American civilians under rationing. But the War Department held its course because the results were visible. Something was changing behind the wire, and that change would soon be examined from even more perspectives. Angle 4. The German officer Angle authority under threat inside the camps. German officers understood the danger before anyone else. Not physical danger. Ideological erosion. The Wehrmacht had survived years of war through discipline and hierarchy. Rank created order. Order maintained belief. Inside captivity, that structure weakened daily. Officers could no longer punish dissent. They could not control reading. They could not prevent conversations after lights dash out. Libraries became focal points of anxiety. Hardline officers watched younger soldiers return from reading rooms with questions instead of slogans. They heard debates that challenged racial doctrine. They noticed fewer salutes, less enthusiasm for party rituals. Some attempted to reassert control through intimidation. Others demanded boycotts of enemy literature. These efforts failed. The American system protected choice. Prisoners could not be punished for reading. Guards intervened when threats escalated. Over time, officers lost their monopoly on truth. In several camps, American authorities deliberately separated staunch Nazis from moderates. The effect was immediate. Without intimidation, discussions expanded. Without fear, curiosity flourished. For German officers trained to equate obedience with survival, this was destabilizing. Their authority had no answer for ideas. Angle 5. The library. Angle shelves as front lines. The libraries themselves were unremarkable in design. Wooden shelves? Folding tables. Bare bulbs. Yet they became the most influential spaces in the camps. Collections were carefully expanded. Not with propaganda, but with breadth. Philosophy sat beside fiction. Science beside political theory. German classics beside American works. Prisoners could request books. Many did. Some asked for titles to confirm what they already believed. Others asked for what they had never been allowed to see. The absence of restriction mattered. In Germany, books had been categorized as loyal or dangerous. In the camps, nothing was labeled. A prisoner could move from Nietzsche to Lincoln to Marx in a single afternoon. That freedom created intellectual momentum. Newspapers amplified the effect. Daily updates contradicted years of controlled messaging. Allied victories were no longer rumors, they were printed facts. Reports of destroyed cities matched letters from home. Eventually, evidence of concentration camps reached the shelves. Some prisoners refused to read further. Others could not stop. Libraries became gathering places. Informal lectures formed. Prisoners translated articles for one another. Knowledge spread horizontally, not from authority. For the first time in years, information moved without permission. Angle 6. The moral angle. Can ideas win wars? The American experiment inside POW camps raised a quiet moral question. If enemy soldiers were treated humanely, educated freely, and exposed to truth, would they change? Or would they merely pretend, waiting to return home unchanged? The answer was not immediate. Nor was it uniform, but what became clear was this: coercion was unnecessary. No loyalty oath was required. No confession demanded. The transformation where it occurred was internal. Men who once accepted orders without reflection now debated morality. Soldiers trained to suppress doubt began questioning responsibility. The idea that obedience absolved guilt weakened. This did not absolve crimes. It did not erase the past. But it created space for accountability, and that space mattered because the war was approaching its final phase. Soon, the quiet intellectual battles inside American camps would collide with the violent collapse of the Third Reich itself. By early 1944, the United States no longer pretended neutrality about what was happening inside its prisoner of war camps. The Evidence was too clear to ignore. Reports from camp commanders across the country described the same pattern. Where libraries expanded, discipline incidents declined. Where discussion groups formed, Nazi intimidation weakened. Where prisoners had access to uncensored information, ideological rigidity softened not always into agreement, but into doubt. For American officials, doubt was enough. That year, the War Department formally authorized what had previously existed only as observation. The effort was placed under the Special Projects Division, a quiet branch of military intelligence staffed not by propagandists, but by historians, sociologists, linguists, and German émigrés who understood the psychology of totalitarian belief. Their mission was narrow and precise. They would not indoctrinate. They would expose. The cornerstone of the program was voluntary education. Attendance was never compulsory. That decision was critical. Compulsion would have confirmed enemy narratives. Choice preserved legitimacy. New courses appeared in selected camps. Classes on European history beyond nationalist myth, on political philosophy, on constitutional systems, on the mechanics of free press, on the structure of American federalism and labor law. Libraries expanded again. By mid-1944, some camps held collections rivaling small colleges. Technical manuals were joined by political essays. Banned authors were no longer exceptions, they were standard. A new German-language newspaper was introduced, Der Ruf, The Call, printed by German prisoners under American supervision. Der Ruf did not shout. It analyzed. It reported Allied advances, postwar planning, and moral responsibility. Its tone was restrained, factual, and deliberately non-inflammatory. There were no caricatures, no slogans, no denunciations. That restraint gave it credibility. Prisoners read it skeptically at first, then carefully, then regularly. Meanwhile, American officials refined prisoner classification. Hardcore Nazi adherents were isolated further. Moderates and undecided prisoners were placed together. The goal was not segregation for punishment, but insulation from intimidation. The result was explosive not outwardly, but internally. Debates that had once been whispered now unfolded openly. Younger soldiers challenged officers without fear of reprisal. Former party members publicly renounced allegiance not dramatically, but matter-of-factly. This was not mass conversion. Many prisoners remained loyal. Some became more defensive. But the center shifted. The intellectual gravity inside the camps moved away from absolutism. For the first time, the United States recognized that it was not merely holding enemy soldiers. It was shaping the mindset of a future Germany. And then, outside the wire, the war itself reached its point of no return. The invasion of Western Europe began. As Allied armies crossed into Normandy, the information reaching American camps grew darker and undeniable. The books, the newspapers, the discussions were no longer theoretical, they were becoming personal. In the years that followed, the impact of the American POW education experiment became visible not in monuments, but in patterns. Former prisoners did not return as a unified group. They returned fragmented, shaped by individual experience, personal loss, and varying degrees of reflection. Yet among those who had spent extended time in U.S. camps, certain tendencies emerged that historians would later document. Many gravitated toward reconstruction roles. Skilled labor was desperately needed. So were teachers, administrators, and translators. Former posts who had studied engineering in camp libraries helped rebuild rail lines and factories. Those who had read widely stepped into classrooms where curricula had to be rewritten from scratch. The intellectual habits formed in captivity mattered here. Critical reading, debate without fear, exposure to plural perspectives. These men had lived, however briefly, inside a functioning democratic information environment. That experience did not erase ideology, but it complicated it. Some former posts participated directly in the cultural renewal of West Germany. A number contributed to newspapers, publishing houses, and educational institutions. Others supported labor organizations and local councils, where compromise replaced command. even those who never spoke publicly carried private influence. In families, in workplaces, in conversations where myths were challenged quietly rather than enforced, American officials observed this with cautious satisfaction. The goal had never been mass conversion. It had been inoculation against absolute obedience, against single-source truth, against the reemergence of ideological monopoly. In that sense, the program succeeded beyond expectation. The U.S. POW library system became a reference point in later Cold War discussions about psychological strategy. It demonstrated that stability could be achieved without coercion, and that exposure to information could undermine authoritarian belief more effectively than force, yet the outcome remained morally complex. No library could undo crimes already committed. No book could restore lives lost. The program did not absolve responsibility, nor was it meant to. What it did was shape the post-war environment in which responsibility could be acknowledged rather than denied. By the early 1950s, Germany was no longer defined solely by defeat. Democratic institutions, fragile but functional, took root. A free press emerged. Universities reopened. Political pluralism returned. The seeds of that transformation were planted in many places. Some were planted in ruins. Others were planted quietly behind barbed wire, between shelves of books, in camps thousands of miles from home. And those seeds carried a lesson that would outlast the war. War is usually remembered through its noise, through explosions, commands, collapsing cities, and the movement of armies across maps. Yet some of its most consequential battles are fought in silence, far from front lines where no medals are awarded and no victories are declared. Inside American prisoner of war camps during the Second World War, one such battle unfolded. It did not require force. It did not demand surrender. It offered no slogans. It simply placed books within reach and allowed men raised under absolute certainty to encounter uncertainty on their own terms. The libraries were not acts of mercy alone. They were instruments of foresight. They recognized that the war would end, and that what followed would depend not only on who won, but on how the defeated understood what had happened. German prisoners did not emerge from those camps as the same men who entered. Not all were changed in the same direction, but few remained untouched by the experience of unrestricted information, open debate, and quiet choice. In a century defined by total war and total ideology, the United States demonstrated something rare, that power could be exercised through restraint, and that democracy could be introduced without coercion. The shelves in those camps held no weapons, yet they dismantled myths more effectively than artillery ever could. When the prisoners returned to a shattered homeland, they carried more than memories of captivity. They carried a lived contrast between enforced belief and voluntary understanding. History often asks how wars are won. This story suggests a different question. What kind of peace is built afterward, and what ideas are allowed to survive it? Sometimes the answer begins not on a battlefield but in a quiet room, where a man opens a book once forbidden and realizes he is free to read it.